From the birth of partition in 1921 to the fall of Stormont in 1972, 6 men held the post of Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. All were leaders of unionism, each personified a particular role as Prime Minister. From Craig, the state builder, Andrews, the ageing caretaker, Brooke, the loyalist squire, O'Neill, the aristocratic reformer, Chichester Clark, the dutiful officer, to Faulkner, the pragmatic hardliner. Unionists in Northern Ireland have had mixed feelings about these men, ranging from deep reverence through ambivalence to contempt. On the other hand, Northern nationalists have, on the whole, regarded them all as the unlovely embodiment of a deeply detested regime. But who were these 6 partly forgotten and still divisive leaders? For most of the people of Northern Ireland, whatever their political choices, these remain largely unknown figures. My name is Alvin Jackson. As an historian, I've written and lectured on Ireland, and Northern Ireland in particular, for over 30 years. In this series, I'm going to reveal the stories of these 6 men who, for better or worse, have left their indelible mark on the North's troubled history. I'm going to reveal the critical moments that defined their time in office, and I'll examine the decisions that they made that shaped the history of Northern Ireland throughout the 20th century. By the end of April 1969, violence and disorder were escalating across Northern Ireland. Having failed to deliver key reforms demanded by the civil rights movement and under pressure from within unionism, Terence O'Neill resigned. He left his party divided over the election of their new leader and Northern Ireland's next Prime Minister. The choice was between James Chichester Clark and Brian Faulkner. As everyone awaited the result of the leadership contest in Belfast, it was Downing Street's view that Brian Faulkner, in fact, would produce the more successful government for Northern Ireland.
I have spoken from the heart, and believe me, I mean every word that I say.
With his background in the family shirt-making firm, Brian Faulkner personified the entrepreneurial spirit of the North's business class. His rival, James Chichester Clark, represented a continuation of the aristocratic and traditional world of big house unionism.
We are not going to waver in any way in pursuing the course on which we have embarked.
In London, the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, fearful of a breakdown in law and order which could provoke the deployment of British troops in Northern Ireland, watched closely as the Unionist Party reached its decision.
I now announce the result. Major J.D. Chichester Clark, 17 votes. To Brian Faulkner, 16.
With the narrowest of margins, on the 1st of May 1969, Major James Chichester Clark became the 5th Prime Minister of Northern Ireland.
Morning.
Desperate to heal divisions within the party and to get back to business, he brought Brian Faulkner into his cabinet. Chairman of the Community Relations Commission, which the Stormont government had created in 1969, was Maurice Hayes. It was a role that gave him a unique insight into the frictions within the Unionist Party and the personality of James Chichester Clark.
He was there largely as a result of an anybody but Brian thing, you know, and what you had was the old county families, really, the old guard coming together and keeping out these rather vulgar tradespeople.
But how soon do you think you'll be able to really bring stability to Northern Ireland? Well, this is a $64 question. All I can do is try and do my best to get...
Chichester Clark was basically a quite honourable man, but not up to it, really, and that was it. It was rather sadly out of his depth.
Only weeks after taking up office, on the 21st of May 1969, Chichester Clark and Faulkner held an urgent meeting with Wilson to assure him of their commitment to reform and to reassure him that the Stormont government had not lost control of the streets. All eyes were now upon James Chichester Clark. But who was the new Prime Minister charged with the task of restoring confidence in Stormont and also halting the slide of Northern Ireland into the mire of civil unrest? Like O'Neill before him, Chichester Clark was privately educated at Eton and trained at Sandhurst Military Academy. An officer in the Irish Guards, he had been seriously wounded in Italy during the Second World War, where his regiment had suffered appalling casualties. Retired from the army in 1960, he entered Unionist politics and inherited the safe South Londonderry seat of his grandmother, Deirdre Parker, the first woman elected to the Northern Ireland Parliament. With the beginning of another marching season in the summer of 1969, the new Prime Minister was confronted with an eruption of sectarian violence on the streets of Derry and Belfast.
Prime Minister, are you very concerned?
Well, of course I'm concerned.
What about the situation likely to occur in Derry in the middle of next month, when, of course, we do expect further orange demonstrations, as there usually are at that time?
I'm concerned with the present at the moment. I'm not going to worry about next month.
Yet the Apprentice Boys' March planned for the 12th of August in Derry had provoked grave concerns inside the Stormont government over a critical outbreak of violence. Chichester Clark knew that if the police failed to control the disorder, he would have no option but request the mobilisation of British troops. But only days before the march, Chichester Clark and his ministers received alarming news that potentially threatened their very existence. In the event of troops being deployed, they would not be controlled by Stormont. Instead, they would be controlled by London itself. Chichester Clark faced an impossible dilemma: risk becoming the Prime Minister who lost control of the streets, or call in British troops and thereby undermine the power of the Stormont government, the bastion of unionism for almost half a century. With all eyes on Derry, in the afternoon of the 12th of August 1969, the Apprentice Boys left St Columb's Cathedral and began their procession through the city. But then, as the march passed close to nationalist housing, a volley of stones was thrown, sparking a riot that engulfed the city. The Battle of the Bogside had begun. With the police losing the battle to contain the rioting, the following day violence also broke out in Belfast. Inside Stormont Castle, the Prime Minister and his cabinet were in emergency session. By then, Chichester Clark was not only under pressure from Derry and London, but also Dublin, where the violence had forced Taoiseach Jack Lynch into contemplating a major intervention across the border.
From the south, it looks like a Northern Nationalist rebellion in pursuit of legitimate demands for civil rights. And it looks indeed like our people, as they're referred to almost universally, could be massacred. So there's intense pressure both on the streets in terms of popular mobilisation, but also at cabinet level, people now demanding that the government take a tough stance.
In the midst of this crisis, Jack Lynch makes a speech of solidarity with Northern nationalism. Maybe you would tell us something about its importance, its resonance.
Well, Lynch promises that the government aren't going to stand by and let innocent people be injured or worse. The speech has an electrifying effect actually north of the border because nationalists expect support now and unionists assume that support is coming. I think by 1969 an unreformed north isn't tenable in terms of southern public opinion. The civil rights movement really hits a nerve in the south. Indeed, many people identify with it very strongly. So I think if Westminster can intervene and they can force reform, I think Lynch would be a lot happier with that.
On the afternoon of the 14th of August, Chichester Clark took a critical decision. He and his ministers issued a request to London for the use of British troops on the streets of Northern Ireland. That permission was granted. There was now no turning back.
Quite clearly, we confront here a deliberate conspiracy to subvert a democratically elected government. The police forces, dealing as they are with armed conspiracy, evidently require reinforcement.
For me, this is fundamentally a portrait of a man under pressure. James Chichester Clark's facial expression reveals that stress. His brow is furrowed. The way in which he delivers his lines is also, I think, very clearly revealing of that stress and strain.
The job will be greatly simplified.
He gets certain phrases in his speech wrong. You can hear the sighs as he delivers what he has to say. But at the end of the day, he's also announcing a shift in the balance of power between Belfast and London to the advantage of the latter. And that's what the introduction of the troops onto the streets of Northern Ireland means. By the autumn of 1969, a further significant deployment of British troops was required to deal with worsening sectarian violence. Two highly critical inquiries commissioned by Downing Street into the Stormont government's handling of the civil disorder and security left Chichester Clark with no option but to accept immediate reforms in policing and local government. By April 1970, his leadership was further undermined by anxiety from within the Protestant majority towards Chichester Clark's reforms, as Stormont by-elections delivered a major blow.
Ian Richard Kyle Paisley, 7,981.
With the election of the Reverend Ian Paisley. Over 2 months later, an attempt to combat the rise of the Provisional IRA with a curfew in West Belfast backfired, turning many nationalists against the British troops.
The curfew area was narrowed. It's hard to conceive that this is a city inside the United Kingdom.
The year had spiralled into mayhem, with both the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries intent on shootings and bombings, and the death toll increasing. Time was rapidly running out for the Prime Minister. By early 1971, Chichester Clark was caught in a trap which had earlier ensnared Terence O'Neill. He was pinned down between the pressures exerted by London government and those arising from paramilitary violence, as well as the expectations of his own support. Under pressure from unionists following the killings of 3 off-duty Scottish soldiers in Belfast by the IRA in March 1971, Chichester Clark flew to London for an urgent meeting with Ted Heath, the new Conservative Prime Minister, and he demanded greater security measures. When Heath offered less than was required, Chichester Clark felt that he had no choice but resignation.
Then I will be making a statement later on. They finished our discussions. Go on, Mr. You are going off now, sir.
Chichester Clark was often a quite disastrous public performer. But even the civil servants around him accepted that he worked hard on his prime ministerial brief. Decency, hard work, and some progressive instincts did not, however, compensate for his political weaknesses. Northern nationalists had very little enthusiasm for Ulster 71, a ill-timed festival marking Northern Ireland's 50th year. But what might once have been a moment of celebration for unionism was instead one of unease as society slid deeper into sectarian violence. For most of those 50 years, two prime ministers, James Craig and Basil Brooke, had seemingly ensured its future. But Stormont's power was becoming increasingly undermined. In such uncertain times, who would be willing to become Northern Ireland's next prime minister? Waiting in the wings was Brian Faulkner, who became the sixth and, in the event, the final Prime Minister of Northern Ireland.
So many people have told me that I'm in the hottest political seat in the world that I doubt whether there's anybody that does want the job.
Committed to bringing a new style of government as Prime Minister, Faulkner shared less with his aristocratic unionist predecessors, O'Neill and Chichester Clark, and more with the middle-class leadership of James Craig. The only Northern Ireland Prime Minister to be educated in the south of Ireland, Faulkner, who had been raised in County Down, had left university during the Second World War to work in his father's factory.
It's a very great responsibility and a very grave one at the present time. I don't think it is any longer a sort of a social perk to be Prime Minister in this country.
Do you think he's going to be a success?
I think if he isn't going to be a success, no one will.
A relatively liberal unionist at the beginning of his political career, by the time he became Prime Minister, Brian Faulkner had long embraced a more hardline position.
Faulkner was a more cautious reformer, and he certainly didn't want it to appear as if reform was being thrust upon Stormont by London or by street protest. He wanted, above all, for unionism to be seen to own reform. He wanted to own reform.
Despite increasing violence, Faulkner made some efforts towards greater inclusivity at Stormont, with the first inter-party talks between the Unionists, the SDLP, the Nationalist Party and the Northern Ireland Labour Party held at Stormont in July 1971. But following the shooting of two Catholic men in Derry by the British Army, the SDLP withdrew from Stormont. Once again, a political initiative was derailed by the dire security situation.
Faced with political stalemate and spiralling political violence, Faulkner took a fateful move. With the backing of London and with the support of the police and the army, he decided to introduce internment onto the streets of Northern Ireland.
The main target of the present operation is the Irish Republican Army. Have taken this serious step solely for the protection of life and the security of property.
On Monday the 9th of August, British troops arrested over 300 people suspected of IRA involvement. But unreliable intelligence led to many people who had no connections to the IRA being detained. The Army's operation provoked serious violence, with 17 people killed within 48 hours. It also further alienated Catholics and nationalists from the Stormont government and acted as a major recruitment drive for the IRA. Breege Rogers was an active member of the SDLP, the new nationalist party that Faulkner had tried to engage with at Stormont.
Because Faulkner supported internment, I think it was a grave mistake. What I remember about internment when he brought it in was, I suppose, the shock that actually it had been introduced. I can't even describe the feeling within the nationalist community, except that I remember going into Lurgan, and quite a few people from Lurgan had been lifted, and one guy who was a teacher and had nothing to do with the IRA. And I remember saying to him afterwards, I says, I didn't know you were in the IRA. And he says, neither did I. Internment was proof to the nationalist community that nothing was changing and that things were going to remain the same and that the British government and the Unionists were just going to use every means in their power to keep the nationalist community in their place.
So Northern Ireland is in an increasingly difficult and troubled position in 1971. How would the SDLP have responded to this situation?
Well, our alternative, which was actually set out in our very first document towards a new Ireland, was that there would have to be power sharing and there would have to be a north-south dimension. If you think about those times and the position that unionists had always held, where they had been dominant, not an inch, never had to give an inch, for them to contemplate a move of that enormity from their point of view was just not on. But I think the SDLP was determined that we would not settle for less.
Nationalist anger deeply intensified after the 30th of January 1972, when British paratroopers opened fire on unarmed protesters attending a civil rights march in Derry. And 14 people lost their lives on what became known around the world as Bloody Sunday. The killings had occurred on Faulkner's watch, yet as he said in private, this is London's disaster, but they will use it against us. Faulkner's analysis was right. On the 22nd of March 1972, he arrived at Downing Street with proposals for reform and plans to restore order. But Heath swept them aside, demanding that all security powers be transferred to Westminster and insisting that a British Secretary of State be installed at Stormont. Blindsided, Faulkner attempted to bargain, but Heath was adamant this was not a negotiation.
Back in Belfast the following morning, Faulkner and his ministers met, and they came to a decision. Faulkner called Downing Street and he told Heath that he and the Stormont government had no alternative. They were resigning. Brian Faulkner is here on the front page of the newsletter, emerging from his ministerial car with his eternally optimistic smile, but he knows the game's up. Direct rule is on the cusp of operation and the transfer of power from his administration to London is about to begin.
On the 28th of March 1972, as Faulkner held his last meeting of the Northern Ireland Cabinet, a massive loyalist crowd gathered outside Stormont in protest against direct rule from London. After the cabinet meeting, Faulkner walked out onto the balcony and addressed the crowd.
We understand absolutely the feelings which have persuaded you to come out to Parliament buildings today, and that not only do we understand your feelings, but, my friends, we share them.
Faulkner rallied the crowd as he grandly proclaimed, "We still have tremendous power. Our power is in the power of our numbers. British are we, and British we remain." But the reality was that he had just lost power, and 50 years of Northern Ireland Parliament and government had come to an abrupt and an inglorious end.
That our consent is needed for any future arrangements for government in Northern Ireland.
John Taylor was Minister of State for Home Affairs in the Stormont government and was on the balcony side by side with Brian Faulkner.
I was in hospital at the time. I was there because in Armagh City there had been an IRA attack on my life. The message came from the Prime Minister to the hospital that they wanted me to appear at the rally. So I was allowed out of the hospital for 4 hours, and Brian Faulkner, it is the first time out of the hospital since I was shot at. And Brian Faulkner was very keen that I should be beside him and presented to the crowd. It was an amazing crowd, one of the biggest demonstrations of unionists in Northern Ireland who were objecting to direct rule.
You were standing right beside Brian Faulkner. What do you think was going through his head at that time?
I think the main feeling would be betrayal by the then government in London. Brian had always been very firm that you cannot govern a country unless you control security. And he'd always suggested that if we lose control, then I will not carry on. And therefore he immediately resigned.
Brian Faulkner was involved in a later attempt to build a more inclusive administration at Stormont, the power-sharing executive and assembly created by the Sunningdale Agreement. But it was brought down by the Ulster Workers' Council strike in 1974. It would take nearly 25 years for an agreement that created a new devolved government at Stormont with the offices of First and Deputy First Minister. Brian Faulkner died suddenly in 1977 in a horse riding accident, and he was buried here in the shadow of the Mournes in County Down. His legacy still divides. Nationalists saw him in the lights of internment and Bloody Sunday. Unionist views were split over Sunningdale. Some who worked with him thought that if he'd been appointed earlier, if he'd built trust with nationalists, he had the ability and the pragmatism to shape a better future for all in the North. These were big ifs.
For 50 years, the Prime Ministers of Northern Ireland had to navigate the sovereignty of Westminster. For much of this time, they'd been left to their own devices, but increasingly they were tempted to believe in their own grandeur, their own indispensability, their own autonomy. But these were fatal temptations. The key concern of the 6 Prime Ministers was the survival of the state. They focused on the unity of unionism. They had little to offer Northern nationalists, those who had not wanted the partition state, those who had no great faith in its capacity to deliver fairness and equality. Across the 20th century, Republicans and Loyalists and the state had all used force to achieve their different ends. Bloodshed had accompanied both the creation of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. Violence, the threat of violence, the reality of violence, the legacies of violence hung like a storm cloud over the Prime Ministers for 50 years.
In the end, the Prime Ministers failed in their different ways. This said something about their own limitations as well as the complex challenges that they faced. Achieving stability and progress in divided societies has almost always required great skill, great generosity, great vision. But greatness of this kind was in very short supply at Stormont in the years between 1921 and 1972.